This week on Dialogue, a conversation with the Wilson Center's president and director, Lee Hamilton. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest this week is Lee Hamilton. Lee served as a member of Congress representing Indiana's 9th Congressional District for 34 years. He left Congress in 1999 and has served as director and president of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars ever since. He's stepping down from that post later this year and will return to Indiana, where he will still be involved with the Center on Congress at Indiana University. Lee, welcome to Dialogue. Welcome back to Dialogue.
John, glad to be with you.
So, doing the math, it would have been 1965 that you arrived in town?
That's correct.
When you got here, did you have any idea you would be here this long?
No, I expected to be here a few terms and then go back and practice law in Indiana, but it turned out differently.
You caught the bug, Potomac fever? You like being here?
Well, I guess I did. I felt very much in the Congress as if I was a bit player in a important drama. I felt very much like I was at the center of things. It was exciting. It was challenging. I think in many ways government service in the Congress and in other positions as well is challenging, and the sheer complexity and difficulty of the problems that you deal with is one of the reasons you are challenged by it.
Did you come from a tradition of public service? How did you first decide to run for elective office?
I was rather slow getting there, John. No, the answer is no. My father was a Methodist minister. I had no politicians in the family. I went through college without really knowing what I was going to do. Traveled for a year, went to law school, practiced law for a few years. And only during the period when I was practicing law did I decide that I'd try for politics, and I did that.
What was the best thing about being a member of Congress?
I think the best thing is that you have a sense that you're working on important issues, and you're trying to help shape the direction and the success of the country. There are a lot of frustrating aspects to the Congress, but you do have a sense of mission, a sense that you're doing something.
Work with purpose.
Working for a real purpose, and that's very satisfying.
On that frustration side of the equation, what's the worst thing?
Progress comes inch by inch. It doesn't come mile by mile. You see that this country is very big and it's very complicated, and it's very hard to make it work. So the progress you make is always a source of some dissatisfaction to you because particularly in the legislative process, it's a very slow, tedious, step-by-step process.
What about, of all the people you've worked with over the years, who do you admire the most?
Well, I'm not sure I have a single person.
A list of a couple.
No, I have a list probably of a very long one, but I'd leave out a lot of people too. I have a much higher opinion of members of Congress, people who have worked in the executive branch probably than the average American has. They're dedicated people. They really do want to do the right thing. I know there are a few people who fall far short of the standards, but by and large, I am impressed in Washington with the quality of the people that are working on the problems our nation has. And I say that knowing that there is in the public today, and probably has been, a deep dissatisfaction with the government and its the people who work for it.
Is there anything you can do about that? I know a lot of your work with the Center on Congress is trying to build a better understanding between constituents and elected members. Is this just sort of built into the American character that we're always distrusting of government?
I think there's a long history in this country of passionate clashes on big issues. I don't think people should fall off their chair if somebody disagrees with them. It's not unusual when you elect members to Congress that you elect people who feel strongly one way or the other about the issue. It's important to understand that the issues that you're debating are important issues, that people can have very different points of view on them. The fact that somebody disagrees with you doesn't mean they're mean-spirited or their motivations are not admirable. It's just that they analyze the problem differently and the solution differently. And you have to have that fundamental respect, if you would, for the other person in order to make the system work well. I think our political process is messy. I think it's often not very directed. I know people are disappointed with the quality of the political dialogue in the country, but it's important for people to understand that our country has always had these very strong debates on public issues. We always will have. It's part of democracy. It's an important part of it. And the American people have to have an understanding of how complex these problems are. I guess I'm sounding a little too defensive about the system, but that does strike me often. I don't mean to excuse a lot of the unfortunate activity, the mean-spiritedness that we see in a lot of American politics today. But making this country work is a lot harder than most people think.
Along these lines, conventional wisdom says it's more partisan than ever, or that things are more complex than ever. What's really changed? I mean, sometimes this is a function of short memory. We forget how polarized the country was during, say, the Vietnam debate. Yeah. What do you think has really changed?
I think what's really changed in my career, when I started in the mid-1960s, long time ago now, I'd sum up with a single word: intensity. I think the intensity of our politics has ratcheted up very sharply. I mean by that a lot more money in the system. I mean by that a lot more actors in the system. The media attention is a lot closer to politicians than it used to be. Voters are very much better informed. They get their information from a variety of sources. The quick, easy example is when I came to the Congress, we would work on an agricultural bill. You had to deal with 4 or 5 basic constituencies, large farm organizations. When I left the Congress, to put an agricultural bill together, you had to deal with 50 or 60 groups. You had a corn group, a soybean group, a school lunch program group, soybeans. I was even approached in my last year by a group favoring macadamia nuts.
And that's just one issue.
It's on one issue, agriculture. So intensity is the key. Many more groups, well-informed, well-represented in Washington. Lobbying has become a very intense activity today. Money flows in all sorts of ways to political campaigns and many other ways to get money into the hands of politicians who are seeking it, of course, to get reelected. So that's one big change. The second big change that has impressed me is that when I ran back in the 60s, everybody would say to me, "Get the government off my back." I just heard it everywhere I went. Fast forward to today, and what you see is everybody coming into Washington not saying, "Get the government off my back," but "Get the government to do something for me. Give me a tax break, change this regulation, draft this kind of legislation that benefits me and my group." So the attitude of the American people, I think, has dramatically changed toward government. Get rid of it, on the one hand. Today, what can I get from government?
But now we seem to be at this juncture where people want things from the government, but they don't want to pay for them.
Well, no question about that. The biggest, toughest problem in politics is dealing with that very phenomenon. People want more government for less money at a time when the population of the United States continues to expand, so there are always more people out there. It's a formidable task and really fundamentally an impossible one to meet as a politician. People are ardent supporters of government activity in areas they want. For example, medical research is a good example. You have dozens, hundreds of groups lobbying Congress on medical research for special kinds of diseases. And every one of them can make a pretty powerful, compelling case. The problem is paying for all of it. And of course, you multiply that kind of a problem many times and you see the difficulties the Congress confronts.
You've described just how difficult it is and how most people probably don't really appreciate fully how difficult it is. Are we talking about a nation that's moving toward a point of almost being ungovernable? We've seen so many stalled attempts at legislation on the Hill, and the opposition party just saying no. It really, to some, appears to not be working.
To a lot of people, I think, John, it appears that it's not working, and I think it's a formidable challenge. If you read the biographies of the 19th century politicians, all men, one of the things that struck me at least is that they dealt with a handful of issues in their lifetime, slavery being the big one. It's probably self-serving to say so, but today a politician deals with 4 or 5 issues before lunch.
Right.
So what's happened is that the problems have come at us with much greater complexity and rapidity than they have in the past. And it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, I worry about it myself, whether this nation, so conceived, so dedicated, in Lincoln's words, can long endure. Can we handle all these problems coming at us? I'm not pessimistic about that, but on the other hand, I think it's a formidable challenge for the system.
If you could change a thing or 2 or 3, are the needs structural? Do we need structural change, or is it a cultural change, or some combination?
It's a combination of things. Can we structure the Congress? Can we structure the executive branch better to deal with these problems? The answer is clearly yes. But Americans always have a kind of instinct to solve a problem by institutional, organizational change. That's probably a good instinct, because a lot of problems can be solved that way, but a lot of cannot. And if the problem is cultural, as you've referred to it, or in your opening comments, or if it's attitudinal, it's much, much more difficult to deal with. So the problems we confront, I think, can be helped, can be abetted by organizational, institutional change, but to fundamentally solve them, you really have to have attitudinal change.
Lee, I want to ask you a bit about your work here at the Wilson Center. You became known as a specialist in foreign policy, and so an international center for scholars seemed like a natural fit. But beyond that, what was the initial attraction?
I had been in the world of politics, in the Congress and government. I was looking for a different kind of a challenge. I considered practicing law. I considered going with some consulting firms. But what attracted me to the Wilson Center was its mission, its emphasis on how the academic world can inform the political world, and how the political world can benefit from the world of academics and vice versa. Wilson, as you know, was a scholar, a first-rate scholar, probably one of the handful of the finest political scientists this country has produced, but he was also a politician, and he always lived in both worlds. And I saw the Wilson Center as a place that could inform, improve, enhance the public dialogue.
Now, I've heard you certainly to staff and to visitors make the distinction that this is not a think tank. Could you make that distinction for our viewers? Explain the difference between the Wilson Center and a think tank.
Well, we have some marvelous think tanks in Washington, and they are very, very focused on the immediate issues of the day, healthcare, Afghanistan, whatever. and they make a lot of recommendations. I think they play a terribly important part in the public policy debates in this country and in this city. The Wilson Center is not quite geared that way. We do some of that, but we try to bring a better understanding to a public policy challenge by putting a lot of emphasis on context and history. And it's a more standoffish perspective. It's trying to inform the debate in all of its aspects. I picked up an article the other day. I saw a general quoted in Iraq, and he said in the quote, "We've never really understood this place." And I said to myself, the general's exactly right. And what the Wilson Center brings to a debate, I think, is just this. We try to give a broader understanding of the problem, and we make some recommendations, but what we don't do is engage with the same intensity, regularity, passion that the think tanks do. The other big difference is that the Wilson Center really is genuinely nonpartisan. We carry on the dialogue of democracy here in the way it ought to be done. Constructive, civil, serious, not mean-spirited, not partisan, not highly partisan. We all have our different points of view. We carry on that debate in a way to try to harmonize ideas, not to be more divisive in the country. We carry it on, I think, in the spirit that says, in the words of Justice Hand, we're not too sure we're right. And I like that spirit about the Wilson Center. And I think it carries on the dialogue of democracy that we talk a lot about here in a manner that it ought to be done. And it is not the kind of noise that you have in much of the public debate today.
Well, certainly this could be interpreted as self-serving, but it would seem to me that there's a now more than ever aspect to this kind of work.
Yeah.
In this era of harsh partisanship, certainty, unlike Justice Hand, and this notion that, bring your own facts to the table. Certainly here evidence matters.
All of us sit in meetings in the Wilson Center, I've done it a dozen times, and say to ourselves, well, I don't agree with that, or I do agree with it. But what impresses you about our meetings is that you have serious people approaching the problem, discussing it in an informed manner. You may not agree with them, but they're very approachable.
And respectful.
And there's a real respect that goes on. Now, compare that to so much of the political debate today, and I think we're setting a pretty good example here, if I do say so.
Let's switch to foreign policy, which became your area of specialization. How did that happen?
By accident. I came to the Congress and asked to be on the Public Works Committee because I thought I could do more for my district. That committee was not available to me. So a leading member of the Congress came to me and said, Lee, we've got a vacancy on foreign affairs. I had spent a year abroad studying, and my interest in foreign affairs had kind of picked up. Certainly wasn't any kind of an expert. So I said yes. And that's the way my career developed. At one point, John, the Speaker of the House at the time, Carl Albert, came to me, said, Lee, I want to appoint you to the Ways and Means Committee, which of course is a cherished appointment for a member of Congress. I'll never forget, I responded to him by saying, I'd like to think about it for a day. He was astounded because he just expected me to accept automatically. The next day I went into his office and said, no, I'm not going to do it.
He wasn't used to hearing no, I'm guessing.
He never heard. 2 or 3 weeks later, he came up to me on the floor and he said, Lee, I think you must be the dumbest man in the United States Congress because you didn't take that job. He couldn't understand it. But I liked foreign affairs, and I knew I was making a judgment there, doing something I liked versus a position of more power in the Ways and Means Committee. I've been very comfortable with my choice.
I've heard you in recent interviews talk about how I think you've described yourself as becoming more conservative when it comes to the exercise of U.S. power and influence.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Well, I have. I wouldn't be surprised if the American people have too. We've just learned how tough it is when you go to Iraq and when you go to Afghanistan. And you can move in with enormous military power and clear out the place rather quickly, as we did in Iraq, and find out that you really haven't solved the problem. Military power is important, but not sufficient. And we have come to understand how very difficult it is to build another nation. And like the general I quoted a little earlier, these things, we never fully understood Iraq. We didn't. So I don't draw the conclusion from that the United States should withdraw and become an isolationist power. I'm very much a believer in American leadership in the world. But I think the question of military intervention is a very, very tough question. And it is far more than a military problem. It has economic, political aspects to it that are equally important as the security problems. And I think as a result of Iraq and Afghanistan, I would say to myself, now hold on here, let's be very, very sure what we're going to do before we put the lives of young men and women at stake to nation build a country. If you ask yourself, John, about Afghanistan, or who's going to be in Afghanistan 10 years from now? It's not likely to be the Americans. We may be there in some capacity, but not in a large capacity. You can bet for sure that the Afghans will be there, that the Taliban will still be there. So the question really becomes, what can we accomplish in a very short period of time with considerable resources?
That will have enough stability to withstand our exit.
That's exactly the point. I think we want to come out of these countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, with the feeling that we've at least, at enormous cost, at least given them an opportunity for some kind of stability. We may or may not be successful in that, but we hope that we will be.
If you were setting the agenda, have you thought about it in these terms, prioritizing? There's so many challenges in the world, but if you were going to pick the top 2 or 3 foreign policy challenges, what's at the top of your list?
Well, the top of my list would be nuclear proliferation. Maybe not the most immediate problem, but it certainly is the most consequential. Mm-hmm. We're at a kind of a cusp here, a brink. We've had reasonable success over the last 50 years of keeping down the number of nations that had nuclear weapons. Today, you're at a point where not only do you have the problem nations like Iran and North Korea, but you have a number of other nations that are showing a lot of interest in developing nuclear power and nuclear weapons. So we could easily, within the next decade or more, have a good many additions to the nuclear club. And with each new addition, you intensify the problems. The consequences of nuclear weapons in the hands of a bad man are just horrible to contemplate. So that would be my number one problem. There are a lot of others, but that would be the one where I think American foreign policy should devote much more attention to than we are.
Now, you're going to leave the Wilson Center, but you're not going to leave public life completely.
No.
Tell us about what you're going to be doing afterwards. I know the Center on Congress I mentioned earlier. Still staying on presidential commissions?
I'm going through now the process of trying to figure out what commissions I should carry on with and which ones I should set aside. And I will be running the Center on Congress at Indiana University. So I will be leaving Washington, but coming back from time to time.
What are you going to miss most?
Oh, I think the people. That's
the relationships you've built up.
Obviously, the most important in all of our lives, the people that we work with and associate with. But Washington's a wonderful city, and it gives you a sense of being at the center of things. Mm-hmm. I've had that sense very strongly, and I will miss that without any doubt.
You leave with any significant regrets?
Amazingly few.
That's great.
I leave with a lot of appreciation for many, many people that I've worked with. I certainly am not bitter. I've felt like I've had a great experience here. Some things I didn't accomplish that I might want to have, but very, very few regrets.
Give us, this is one of the toughest things to figure out. I don't even know if I can do it justice in a question, but I've seen you operate working here on a daily basis and then before working here from a distance. Mm-hmm. And the ability you have to work with people with whom you don't agree. Can you give us any, we certainly need that. Can you give us, have you thought about it? How do you do it?
Well, I've spent my lifetime working in an environment where you have differences of opinion. I think a lot of Americans avoid that situation if they can. They find it unpleasant. And so they tend to
even within their own family.
That's right, with their own people, people who think alike. But John, what strikes me is that, going back really to earlier comment, is that we got a great big complicated country here. And it's a marvelous country. It has tremendous diversity in it, and I think the skill that is most needed, not just in government, but all kinds of organizations, is the skill to work together. I think that's a real political skill. Whether you're talking about running the church or the synagogue, or you're talking about running the United States Congress, you need people who can bring people together. There are a lot of political skills, and we often think of being able to give a speech and so forth, but the real political skill is to bring people together. It's very easy to go into a room where you have differences of opinion and blow it apart. Mm-hmm. I've probably done that myself a number of times. What's really hard is to go in that room and try to bring people together. That's the skill we need.
Well, I'm not usually in the habit of speaking for others, but I think I can in this case, certainly speaking for all the staff here and probably a big chunk of the town. We're going to miss you. Wow. Thank you for showing us up close what a statesman looks like.
Wow, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for your contributions.
Thanks. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.